let's get back into this book. And let's begin to take some steps forward by taking some giant steps back. Page 81. Now, in my reading, I'm almost at page 300 now. But let's jump all the way back to 81. Because like most of these seminars, you never know where the big insight's going to pop up. Here, the big insight on page 81 starts about the middle of the page. I propose putting the problem in the following terms. Anytime Lacan comes out and gives you this kind of categorical, let's put it in the following terms, let's as follows, and he's about ready to spell something out for you. He knows that things get a little wild and meandering, and every now and again he probably senses something in the audience, like most speakers do, that he needs to stop for a minute and just categorically state what's going on. Page 81 gives us some of this. I propose putting the problem in the following terms. Prior to all symbolization, this priority is not temporal but logical. Now that's really important, but let's get through the sentence first and come back, because we've talked about this passage before. Prior to all symbolization, a priority that's not temporal but logical, there is, as the Psychoses demonstrate, a stage at which it is possible for a portion of symbolization not to take place. So, we can, for purposes of understanding this passage, replace symbolization with language or language use. So prior to a child's beginning to use language, there is, if they're psychotic, a stage of language adaptation that has not taken place. So the question is, for the origin of psychosis, which is a very important topic for Lacan, and one that's really at the center of these lectures of his, is what is this prior stage that doesn't take place for the psychotic but does take place for us? What is this prior to all symbolization? Now, it's important that this is not a temporal priority but a logical one. Here we're not dealing with an actual developmental stage that a kid went through, more like something that is logically presupposed by the fact that most people speak regular English, regular language, the mother tongue, wherever they may be. It really doesn't matter what language they speak. It's the fact of language itself. And this prior stage, this logical priority, this a priori condition, precondition for using language is, at some sense, very simple. It is simply the acceptance of the existence of language. And it's an acceptance that is also an alienation, because you accept that everybody around you is using a medium, a language, speech, in a way that is foreign to you. You didn't invent this language. The words are all new to you. Little kids for a very long time, and if they're great kids, they'll turn into great adults that ask the very same question over and over again. What's that mean? What's that about? How often do you hear from a 6-year-old, what's that word mean? And then you explain it, which raises other words, and the kid says, well, what's that word mean? Every word is new to them, but it's not just new. Language, first and foremost, is experienced as an alien or a foreign agent, a foreign structure that the kid has to get used to. You'll recall when we talked about the difference between need and demand. A need is a biological, physical impulse. And when the kid doesn't have language, when it's a baby, it cries. It's just a raw expression of need. As the child gets older, though, need gives way to demand. Not that needs ever go away, but needs find expression in language, in symbolization. The kid learns that if it's going to have its needs met, it has to use the mother tongue, the tongue of the mother, the words that belong to the parents, in order to express their needs. A demand which from the French would really be more like a request, but demand gets at it pretty well. A demand is a need expressed in language. But notice, in order for a child to take their felt need and put it into language, there has to be this prior acceptance. It's an acceptance of that language as the medium in which need will be expressed. This is that prior symbolization. This is that moment that Lacan calls Bejahung. A pure, primitive Bejahung, he calls it on page 82. This is a primitive symbolization that most of us go through. This point at which we accept that we are part of a world that is not of our own creation, that is beyond our control, certainly well beyond our mastery. At the point at which we accept this, we accept that if we're going to get things done for ourselves in this world, we have to enter into an alien structure, language. We have to start speaking and acting in ways that are foreign to us. We have to give up on doing things exactly as we want and now start doing them the way our parents or primary caregivers want, our teachers want, our peers want. That stage in Lacanian psychoanalysis is referred to as castration. Alienation is a good word for it too. It's this primitive acceptance that if we're going to get anything done for ourselves in this world, we have to use tools not of our own making. In order to make something of this life, we have to use tools that are not of our own making. That process is called castration. Not because anybody is physically operating on your swimsuit zone. It's because you give something up. You give up the previous existence you had where you just did whatever you wanted. When you needed to go to the bathroom, you simply peed or pooped, hence the diapers you were wearing. When you were hungry, you didn't wait for dinner to be served. You just started crying, and you cried until somebody brought you some food. Same with when you were cold, when you were uncomfortable, when you were tired. There was no perseverance. And that's what little kids learn. School teachers talk about this. Your daughter's doing great. She has excellent perseverance. She's a resilient kid. She's patient. All of these skills, patience is a virtue, we hear. The reason why it is because originally we didn't have none. Originally, we just acted on our impulses. That kind of patience, that willingness to wait, Freud is going to call that the reality principle. The reality principle marks the human being's ability to wait. The willingness to wait, the ability to wait, presupposes the acceptance that there are other people and other forces in the world that are not yours. In other words, that the world does not revolve around you. And that's part of what castration gets at a very fundamental level. You recognize that the basic medium in which you're going to get things for yourself, food, clothing, shelter, and the like, the medium in which you're able to secure those elements is not of your own creation. It's foreign, it's alien, and it's called language. This is what's happening prior to all symbolization. We don't say it's temporal because the child doesn't sit down and be like, okay, I've got a choice to make. I can either accept language or not. What am I going to do? What's my opportunity here? What do I do? And that's not what happens. It's logical because in order to start using language, you have to, at some basic level, accept its existence. Now, if we're going to sub out language here with another word, which is very easy to do, we can call it the symbolic. The symbolic is what we're talking about here. In order to enter into it and to start using symbols, in order to start using language, there's a prior acceptance of the symbolic's existence. This is that term Bejahung that we see on 82, a term that's been popping up very early in the book, Bejahung, a primitive symbolization. Now, and this is exactly what does not happen in the case of the psychotic. The psychotic does not accept, maybe doesn't even get the opportunity to accept their own castration. They reject it. They don't accept that there is a force outside them that they have to fit into. You see, that's what happens. When Heidegger says language is the house of being, he means many things. But one way to read that is, language is the place where we call home. It's where we inhabit. It's where we become ourselves. It's where we find our place. Language at this level is a structure, like a house, that you enter into. You enter into this structure and you find yourself there. You find your place at the table in the house. This is what the symbolic provides to the neurotic subject. A space in which to belong, a sense of positioning. We talk about it now in terms of positionality, but the same principle applies here. Language provides a structure or a container into which a previously deranged, running around, crying person can now find an identity. The psychotic missed that opening. Something happened, something went down where this prior symbolic activity of accepting the symbolic as a container did not occur. On page 81, we read on. This initial stage precedes the entire neurotic dialectic, because the neurotic is somebody who actually did accept their castration, their alienation, which is due to the fact that neurosis is articulated speech. Neurotics talk a lot. Insofar as the repressed and the return of the repressed are one and the same thing. It can thus happen that something primordial regarding the subject's being does not enter into symbolization and is not repressed but rejected. This is another key point, and the final key point in this little mini lecture to note. In the case of the neurotic, they accept their alienation in language, and then they repress that experience. They repress castration. They undergo it, and then they promptly push it to the side and try to forget that it ever happened. And suddenly they try and own language. They want to be in charge of language. They forget that it's the container in which they are aliens, and instead try and occupy it in a way that makes them seem like they're in control. The neurotic represses Bejahung. They undergo it. They have that primitive symbolization, and then they repress that experience. The psychotic does not repress because they're unable to symbolize. What's repressed is a symbol of some experience you've had. Remember, it's not the car crash itself that you repress. It's some symbolic aspect of that car crash, the feel of the fabric on your skin that you were wearing that day. Some symbol of the car crash gets repressed. Not so in the case of the psychotic. They've not undergone the symbolic. They've not accepted symbolization as their Lord and Savior. They've rejected that. So the move here is not repression, that's the case of the neurotic, but rejection. Verwerfung. That is what the psychotic undergoes. They reject their castration. They refuse their alienation. This primitive Bejahung that the neurotic undergoes and then represses, the psychotic refuses to accept undergoing in the first place. They don't accept it and then move on. They reject it and then move on. And what follows in the case of the psychotic all flows from this primitive rejection. This primitive rejection of what on the next page Lacan defines as Bejahung, which you can look up in the Dylan Evans dictionary. At the level of this pure primitive Bejahung, which may or may not take place, it does in the case of the neurotic, it doesn't in the case of the psychotic. An initial dichotomy is established. What has been subject to Bejahung, to primitive symbolization, will have various destinies. What has come under the influence of primitive Verwerfung, here we're talking about rejection, will have another. Let's pause there.